Imagine being so consumed by a character that you forget where the performance ends and where you begin. Imagine walking onto a film set as one person and walking off as someone fundamentally different. That's exactly what happened to Jack Nicholson during the filming of The Shining, and what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about method acting, madness, and the thin line that separates genius from insanity. In 1980, audiences watched Jack Nicholson deliver one of the most terrifying performances in cinema history, but what they didn't see were the 127 days of psychological warfare, the endless retakes that pushed him to the brink, and the moments when the cameras stopped rolling but Jack Torrance never left the building. This isn't just a story about making a movie. This is a story about what happens when an actor goes so deep into darkness that finding the way back becomes impossible. When Jack Nicholson signed on to play Jack Torrance in Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining, he thought he understood what he was getting into. After all, by 1978, Nicholson was already a Hollywood legend. He'd won an Oscar for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, delivered unforgettable performances in Easy Rider, Five Easy Pieces, and Chinatown, and established himself as one of the most versatile actors of his generation. He was known for his intensity, his commitment to his craft, and his ability to disappear into roles. But nothing in his career had prepared him for Stanley Kubrick, and nothing in his experience could have warned him about the psychological journey he was about to undertake. Kubrick was notorious for his perfectionism, his obsessive attention to detail, and his willingness to do whatever it took to capture authentic human emotion on film. He didn't direct actors so much as he orchestrated elaborate psychological experiments, and Jack Nicholson was about to become his most ambitious subject yet. The production of The Shining began in May 1978 at Elstree Studios in England, and it was supposed to wrap in 17 weeks. It ended up taking over a year. From the very beginning, Kubrick implemented methods that would systematically break down the barriers between Jack Nicholson and Jack Torrance. The Overlook Hotel wasn't just a set, it became a prison, a laboratory, and a hall of mirrors where reality and performance blurred into something altogether more disturbing. Kubrick insisted on practical effects wherever possible, which meant that the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the Overlook wasn't manufactured in post-production. The cast and crew actually worked in those conditions day after day, month after month. The isolation that Jack Torrance experiences in the film wasn't just acted, it was lived. Nicholson found himself spending 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day in character, inhabiting the headspace of a man slowly losing his grip on sanity, and the line between performance and reality began to dissolve. What made Kubrick's approach particularly devastating was his famous penchant for endless retakes. While most directors might do 5 or 10 takes of a scene, Kubrick routinely demanded 50, 60, even over 100 takes. This wasn't about getting the technical aspects perfect. It was about exhausting the actor's conscious defenses and accessing something raw and genuine underneath. When you perform a scene once or twice, you're still in control, still making choices about how to play each moment. But by the 30th take, by the 50th take, something else emerges. The artifice falls away, the performance becomes involuntary, and what the camera captures is no longer acting but something closer to genuine psychological distress. Nicholson understood this intellectually, and as a serious actor, he even appreciated Kubrick's methodology. But understanding something and living through it are entirely different experiences. Take after take after take, Nicholson wasn't just pretending to descend into madness. He was actually experiencing the psychological wear and tear that such a descent would entail. The famous Here's Johnny scene is the perfect example of how Kubrick's methods worked on Nicholson's psyche. In the scene, Jack Torrance has finally snapped completely and is trying to break through a bathroom door with an axe to get to his terrified wife, Wendy. For this sequence, Kubrick had a series of fake doors constructed, and Nicholson was told to attack them as violently as possible. What followed was hours of Nicholson smashing through door after door while Shelley Duvall, who played Wendy, screamed in genuine terror on the other side. The physical exertion alone was exhausting, but it was the emotional intensity that really took its toll. Nicholson had to access a place of pure, uninhibited rage over and over again. He couldn't just pretend to be angry, he had to genuinely feel that fury, that loss of control, that complete abandonment of civilized restraint. And here's the thing about emotions. When you conjure them repeatedly, when you immerse yourself in them for extended periods, they don't just disappear when someone yells cut. They linger. They seep into your subconscious. They become part of your psychological landscape. The iconic line, "Here's Johnny," wasn't even in the script. It was a spontaneous improvisation by Nicholson, a reference to Johnny Carson's Tonight Show introduction. The fact that Nicholson could access his sense of humor even in the middle of such intense psychological work speaks to his professionalism and his skill as an actor. But it also reveals something more troubling. The Jack Nicholson who delivered that line was neither entirely himself nor entirely Jack Torrance. He was something in between, a hybrid consciousness that could blend genuine murderous rage with dark comedic timing. This kind of psychological fragmentation, this ability to hold multiple contradictory states of mind simultaneously, is exactly what happens when an actor stays in an extreme emotional space for too long. You don't just play the character. You become a version of yourself that incorporates the character's psychology into your own. Kubrick recognized what was happening to Nicholson, and far from trying to protect his actor, he exploited it. He would shoot scenes out of sequence deliberately, forcing Nicholson to access different stages of Jack Torrance's psychological deterioration without any logical progression. One day Nicholson might film a scene from early in the movie when Jack is still relatively stable, and the next day he'd jump to a scene from the climax when Jack is completely unhinged. This meant that Nicholson couldn't build the character gradually. He had to be able to access any point on the spectrum of Jack Torrance's madness at any moment. It was like asking a musician to play a symphony by jumping randomly between movements, never knowing which part would come next. The psychological whiplash was enormous, and it required Nicholson to keep all the various versions of Jack Torrance alive in his mind simultaneously, ready to embody any of them at a moment's notice. The other actors on set watched Nicholson's transformation with a mixture of awe and concern. Shelley Duvall later said that making The Shining was the most difficult experience of her life, and much of that difficulty came from Kubrick's treatment of her. But she also spoke about watching Nicholson work and sensing that something profound and troubling was happening to him. In scenes where Jack Torrance was supposed to intimidate or threaten Wendy, Duvall didn't have to act scared because she genuinely was. The intensity Nicholson brought to those moments transcended normal acting. He wasn't threatening her as a character. He was channeling something real and primal, and she could feel it. This is what happens when method acting goes beyond technique and becomes a form of temporary psychological possession. The actor isn't simply imagining what the character would feel. The actor is actually feeling it, and everyone around them can sense the authenticity of those emotions. Between takes, Nicholson would try to decompress, but on a Kubrick film, there was no real downtime. Even when the cameras weren't rolling, the atmosphere on set was tense and charged. Kubrick maintained an environment of constant pressure, never allowing anyone to fully relax. This was intentional. He believed that filmmaking should be an ordeal, that the process of creating art should be difficult and demanding, and that the struggle would be visible in the final product. For Nicholson, this meant that there was no escape from Jack Torrance. He couldn't do a scene, shake it off, and return to being himself. The character followed him to his trailer, lived with him during meals, and waited for him in the quiet moments when he tried to rest. Method actors talk about staying in character between takes, but what Nicholson experienced was something different. It wasn't that he was choosing to stay in character. It was that he couldn't fully get out of character even when he wanted to. The role of Jack Torrance required Nicholson to explore some of the darkest aspects of human psychology. Jack is a man who feels like a failure, who resents his wife and son, who has struggled with alcoholism, and who harbors violent impulses that he's barely keeping under control. To play this authentically, Nicholson had to connect with those shadow aspects within himself. Every person has darkness within them, impulses and feelings that civilized society teaches us to suppress. Actors regularly have to access these shadow elements for roles, but usually it's a controlled process. You tap into the darkness, you use it for the scene, and then you close the door and return to your normal life. But when you're filming a Kubrick movie for over a year, when you're accessing that darkness dozens of times a week in hundreds of takes, the door doesn't close properly anymore. The darkness starts to leak out. It becomes harder to distinguish between the shadow self you're portraying and the civilized self you present to the world. There were reports from the set about Nicholson's behavior becoming increasingly erratic as filming progressed. Crew members noticed that his famous charm and affability were replaced by a brooding intensity. He became withdrawn, spending more time alone between takes. His interactions with others took on an edge that hadn't been there before. Some of this was surely intentional, a choice to maintain the psychological state necessary for the performance. But some of it wasn't. Some of it was the inevitable result of prolonged exposure to extreme emotional states. The human brain doesn't have perfect filters. When you spend months immersed in rage, paranoia, and violence, even in a controlled artistic context, it changes your neural pathways. It alters the way you process emotions and interact with the world. Nicholson was a skilled enough actor and a stable enough person that he never completely lost himself, but the experience marked him in ways that would persist long after filming wrapped. One of the most psychologically demanding aspects of playing Jack Torrance was the character's relationship with his son, Danny. In the film, Jack's love for his son is genuine but increasingly overshadowed by his deteriorating mental state, eventually leading to Jack hunting Danny through the hotel maze in a homicidal rage. For Nicholson, who was a father himself, these scenes required him to access feelings that went against his deepest instincts. A parent's drive to protect their child is one of the most fundamental human impulses, and to convincingly portray the opposite, to embody a father who becomes a threat to his own son, required Nicholson to go to some very dark places psychologically. He had to tap into fears about his own potential for harm, about the violence that might exist within him under the right circumstances. These aren't comfortable things to explore, and once you've acknowledged those possibilities within yourself, you can't completely know them. The physical demands of the role also took their toll. The climactic chase sequence through the hedge maze was filmed in brutal conditions, with Nicholson running through the cold for hours at a time, his breath visible in the frigid air, his body exhausted but his performance undiminished. Kubrick wanted the exhaustion to be real, the desperation to be genuine, and so Nicholson pushed his body to its limits take after take. Physical exhaustion has profound effects on mental state. When your body is depleted, your psychological defenses weaken, your emotional regulation becomes more difficult, and you're more vulnerable to suggestion and influence. Kubrick understood this and used it as another tool to extract authentic performances. By the time they filmed the final scenes of the movie, Nicholson wasn't just acting tired and desperate. He was actually tired and desperate, and that authenticity is part of what makes his performance so compelling and disturbing. The relationship between Nicholson and Kubrick throughout the filming was complex and fraught. On one hand, Nicholson respected Kubrick as a master filmmaker and understood that the director's extreme methods were in service of creating something extraordinary. On the other hand, there were undoubtedly moments of frustration, resentment, and anger at being pushed so hard for so long. Kubrick was known for treating his actors as raw material to be shaped rather than as collaborators, and while Nicholson's star power gave him more agency than most actors would have, he was still subject to Kubrick's authoritarian approach. This created a dynamic that mirrored the film itself, with Kubrick as a kind of overlook hotel, an oppressive presence that brought out the darkness in those trapped within his vision. Nicholson found himself in the strange position of resenting the process while simultaneously recognizing that the process was producing something powerful. As the months of filming stretched on, people who knew Nicholson personally began to notice changes. Friends reported that he seemed different, more intense, less quick to laugh, more prone to sudden mood shifts. These weren't dramatic personality changes, but they were noticeable enough to be concerning. It's important to understand that Nicholson never had a breakdown, never lost his professional composure, never became unable to function. What happened was more subtle and in some ways more insidious. He maintained his ability to do his job at the highest level, but something in his essential nature had shifted. The easygoing charisma that had defined his public persona was now tinged with something darker, something that suggested he'd seen places most people never go and brought something back with him. The legendary scene where Jack types "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy" hundreds of times perfectly encapsulates what was happening to Nicholson during filming. In the scene, Wendy discovers page after page filled with this single sentence, revealing the depths of Jack's madness. What many people don't know is that Kubrick had his secretary actually type out dozens of pages of this text to make the scene more realistic. But the real psychological horror wasn't in the props. It was in Nicholson's reaction when Wendy discovers him. The rage, the violation, the sudden shift from false pleasantness to murderous intent, all of it was channeled through Nicholson with a conviction that goes beyond acting technique. He wasn't imagining how Jack Torrance would feel in that moment. He was actually feeling the emotions, and they were real even if the circumstances were fictional. This is the paradox of method acting taken to extremes. The emotions are genuine even when the situation is fabricated, and genuine emotions have genuine psychological effects. Kubrick's decision to shoot the film at Elstree Studios in England rather than in the United States added another layer of isolation to Nicholson's experience. He was away from his familiar environment, his support system, his normal life. This geographical displacement mirrored Jack Torrance's isolation at the Overlook and made it harder for Nicholson to maintain perspective. When you're in a foreign country, working insane hours, trapped in an oppressive production, it becomes difficult to remember who you are outside of the work. The work becomes your entire reality, and if the work involves embodying madness, then madness becomes your reality. Nicholson was too professional and too psychologically stable to fully succumb to this, but the constant pressure, the lack of relief, the endless months of psychological intensity, all of it accumulated into something that changed him. One of the most revealing aspects of Nicholson's performance is the evolution of Jack Torrance's smile. Early in the film, Jack's smile is warm, charming, reassuring, very much like Nicholson's own famous grin. But as the story progresses, that smile curdles into something threatening. The same facial expression that once signaled friendliness becomes a mask for malevolence. What's fascinating is that Nicholson didn't have to do much to achieve this transformation. The smile is essentially the same, but the context and the eyes change everything. By the end of the film, when Jack is fully consumed by madness, his smile is one of the most disturbing images in the movie. It suggests that the pleasant facade was always just that, a facade, and that the darkness was there all along waiting to emerge. For Nicholson to access this transformation so convincingly, he had to understand intimately how quickly apparent warmth can become actual menace, and that required exploring parts of himself that most people prefer to keep hidden. The film's ambiguous ending, with the reveal that Jack appears in a photograph from 1921, suggesting he's always been part of the hotel, adds a metaphysical dimension to the story that deepened Nicholson's psychological investment in the role. If Jack Torrance isn't just a man going mad but is somehow cosmically connected to the evil of the Overlook Hotel, then the character isn't just descending into insanity but is coming home to his true nature. This gave Nicholson a framework to understand Jack's transformation not as a breakdown but as an unveiling, a stripping away of civilized pretense to reveal the monster that was always there. This is heady, disturbing stuff to work with as an actor, because it requires you to consider your own essential nature and what might be revealed if all your social conditioning were stripped away. When filming finally wrapped in April 1980, nearly a year after it began, Nicholson left Elstree Studios a different person than when he'd arrived. He was exhausted, transformed, and in many ways still partially inhabiting Jack Torrance's psychological space. The film was released in May 1980 to mixed initial reviews, with many critics finding it cold and Nicholson's performance too over the top. Stephen King famously hated Kubrick's adaptation and thought Nicholson was miscast. But audiences responded to the film viscerally, and over time, The Shining has been recognized as one of the greatest horror films ever made, with Nicholson's performance now considered iconic. The journey from the film's release to its current canonical status mirrors Nicholson's own journey in processing what happened to him during filming. In interviews after the film's release, Nicholson was characteristically cagey about his experience making The Shining. He would praise Kubrick's genius, acknowledge the difficulty of the production, but rarely spoke in detail about the psychological toll it took. This reticence is telling. Actors usually love to talk about their process, about how they prepared for roles and what techniques they used. But when an experience goes beyond technique into something more primal and disturbing, talking about it becomes difficult. How do you explain that you went somewhere psychologically that you can't fully articulate? How do you describe the experience of channeling genuine madness in a controlled environment and having that control prove less absolute than you expected? Nicholson's silence on these matters speaks volumes about the depth of the experience and its lasting impact on him. In the years following The Shining, Nicholson's choice of roles and his approach to acting showed signs of being influenced by his Kubrick experience. He became more selective, more careful about the psychological spaces he was willing to inhabit. He continued to deliver brilliant performances in films like Terms of Endearment, Priz's Honor, Batman, A Few Good Men, and As Good as It Gets, but there was a noticeable reluctance to go as deep into darkness as he had in The Shining. When he did play villainous or disturbed characters, like the Joker in Batman, there was always a layer of camp or theatricality that created distance between the actor and the role. This was a choice, a form of self-protection born from understanding what happens when that distance collapses completely. The Shining also affected how other directors worked with Nicholson. Everyone in Hollywood knew what Kubrick had put him through, and while some directors were intrigued by the idea of accessing that level of intensity in Nicholson, others were more cautious. There was a sense that pushing Nicholson too hard, demanding too much psychological authenticity, might unleash something uncontrollable. This gave Nicholson's post-Shining career a particular texture, with directors either tiptoeing around his intensity or specifically hiring him because they wanted to evoke echoes of Jack Torrance in their own films. Either way, The Shining became a defining marker in his career, a before and after that everyone in the industry recognized, even if they didn't fully understand what had transpired during that year-long production in England. What makes the story of Nicholson's transformation during The Shining so compelling is that it raises fundamental questions about the nature of acting, identity, and the costs of artistic excellence. We celebrate great performances, but we rarely think about what actors have to do to themselves psychologically to deliver those performances. Method acting, which emerged from the Stanislavski system and was popularized in America by teachers like Lee Strasberg, is based on the idea that authentic emotion is the foundation of authentic performance. But authenticity comes at a price. When you repeatedly access extreme emotional states, when you blur the line between your own psychology and a character's psychology, you risk changing yourself in permanent ways. Nicholson's experience is an extreme example, but it's not unique. Actors throughout history have talked about roles that changed them, characters that haunted them, performances that required them to go places they wished they hadn't. Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker, which earned him a posthumous Oscar, is often discussed in these terms, with many people believing that the psychological demands of the role contributed to his death. While the circumstances are different, the underlying dynamic is similar. An actor commits so fully to a role that the boundaries of self become permeable, and something from the character's psychology bleeds into the actor's own. The interesting thing about Nicholson is that he was already an established star with a distinctive persona when he made The Shining. He wasn't a young actor trying to prove himself. He was at the height of his powers and his fame. This meant that he had a strong sense of self going into the production, which ultimately provided some protection. A younger, less established actor might have been completely overwhelmed by the experience, but Nicholson had the psychological resources and the professional experience to survive it. Still, surviving isn't the same as emerging unscathed. Even with all his strength and stability, the experience marked him, changed him, left traces that would persist for the rest of his career and his life. Stanley Kubrick died in 1999, and Nicholson attended his memorial service. One wonders what thoughts went through Nicholson's mind as he paid respects to the director who had pushed him further than anyone before or since. Was there gratitude for the opportunity to give one of the great performances in cinema history? Was there lingering resentment about the methods used to extract that performance? Was there a complex mixture of both, an acknowledgement that something valuable was created but at a cost that maybe shouldn't have been paid? We'll never know for certain, but the fact that Nicholson made the trip to honor Kubrick suggests that, decades later, he recognized the experience as significant, transformative, and in its own way, meaningful, even if it was also difficult and damaging. The cultural impact of The Shining has only grown over the decades. The film has been analyzed, deconstructed, and theorized about more than almost any other horror movie. Documentaries like Room 237 explore the various interpretations people have found in Kubrick's film, from allegories about the genocide of Native Americans to conspiracies about Kubrick faking the moon landing footage. Nicholson's performance is at the center of all these discussions, his face frozen in various expressions of madness becoming iconic images reproduced endlessly in popular culture. The "Here's Johnny" scene in particular has been parodied and referenced so many times that it's become separated from its original context, a free-floating signifier of horror and madness that exists independently of the film. This cultural omnipresence means that Nicholson can never fully escape Jack Torrance. Even now, decades after the film was released, it remains one of the first things people think of when they think of Jack Nicholson. For an actor, having created such an iconic character is both a blessing and a curse. It ensures immortality and secures a place in cinema history, but it also means being eternally associated with that role's dark psychological terrain. Every time someone makes a reference to The Shining, every time the film is discussed or analyzed, Nicholson is transported back to that year at Elstree Studios, to those endless takes, to that psychological space he inhabited so completely that he never fully left it behind. There's a particular poignancy to watching Nicholson's later career with knowledge of what The Shining required of him. His performances in his 50s, 60s, and 70s showed a man who was still capable of great work but who seemed to have built walls around certain psychological territories. He could still be intense, charming, funny, and moving, but there was a sense that he was more protective of himself, more aware of boundaries, more careful about how deep he was willing to go. This wasn't a failure or a limitation. It was wisdom born from experience. He had learned that there are costs to the kind of total commitment he brought to The Shining, and he wasn't willing to pay those costs again. The Shining also changed how we think about horror performance more broadly. Before Nicholson's work in the film, horror movie acting tended toward the theatrical and exaggerated. Nicholson brought a psychological realism to the genre that raised the bar for everyone who came after. His performance proved that horror could be taken seriously as a vehicle for genuine dramatic work, not just as a genre exercise. This opened the door for actors like Toni Collette in Hereditary, Lupita Nyong'o in Us, and countless others to bring their full dramatic talents to horror films, knowing that the genre could accommodate and reward serious acting. In this way, Nicholson's sacrifice, if we can call it that, benefited not just the film itself but the entire genre and the actors who work within it. When we watch The Shining today, knowing what we know about the production, Nicholson's performance takes on additional layers of meaning. We're not just watching an actor play a character descending into madness. We're watching an actor who genuinely experienced a form of psychological transformation in the process of creating that performance. There's a documentary quality to it, a sense that the camera is capturing something real and unrepeatable. This is what separates truly great performances from merely good ones. The sense that what we're seeing on screen isn't just crafted but is somehow truthful in a way that transcends technique. The question of whether it was worth it, whether the artistic achievement justifies the personal cost, is one that each person will answer differently. From a purely artistic standpoint, The Shining is a masterpiece, and Nicholson's performance is a crucial element of its power. Millions of people have been moved, terrified, and fascinated by the film over the past 4 decades. It has enriched our culture and expanded our understanding of what cinema can achieve. But this cultural value was purchased with Nicholson's psychological well-being, with months of his life spent in a state of controlled distress, with lasting changes to his personality and approach to his craft. Is one masterpiece worth one man's peace of mind? It's an impossible question to answer definitively, but it's one worth asking. What we can say with certainty is that Nicholson's experience on The Shining reveals something important about the nature of artistic creation at its highest level. Great art often requires sacrifice, not in a metaphorical sense but in a literal, material, psychological sense. The artist must give something of themselves, must venture into territories that are uncomfortable or dangerous, must risk something essential in pursuit of their vision. Nicholson took that risk, made that sacrifice, and delivered a performance that will live forever. But he also paid a price that is less visible, less celebrated, and less understood. The man who walked onto the set of The Shining in May 1978 wasn't quite the same man who walked off in April 1980, and he would never be quite the same again. In his later years, Nicholson largely withdrew from acting, giving his last on-screen performance in 2010. While he cited various reasons for stepping back from film work, one can't help but wonder if the accumulated psychological wear and tear of a career spent inhabiting other consciousnesses had finally caught up with him. After decades of channeling other people's emotions, other people's madness, other people's rage and joy and sorrow, perhaps he simply needed to be himself for a while, to inhabit only his own consciousness without the intrusion of characters and performances. If that's the case, it's a reminder that acting, especially at the level Nicholson practiced it, is not a trivial or easy profession. It requires sacrifices that are invisible to audiences but deeply felt by the performers themselves. The legacy of Jack Nicholson's work in The Shining extends far beyond the film itself. It has become a touchstone for discussions about method acting, about the relationship between art and mental health, about the responsibilities directors have to their actors, and about the hidden costs of cultural monuments. Film students study the performance, trying to understand how Nicholson achieved such intensity. Psychologists analyze it, looking for insights into the nature of madness and performance. Cultural critics examine it, exploring what it says about masculinity, violence, and the American family. All of this discourse circles around the central fact of Nicholson's commitment, his willingness to go to those places and bring back something we could all witness and learn from. There's a scene late in The Shining where Jack, now fully consumed by the hotel's evil influence, sits at the bar in the Gold Room, talking to the ghostly bartender Lloyd about his failures and frustrations. Nicholson's performance in this scene is a masterclass in controlled intensity, his voice never rising to a shout but conveying bottomless wells of bitterness and rage. Watching this scene with knowledge of the production context, you can see the exhaustion in Nicholson's face, the genuine weariness that comes from months of psychological extremity. It's not makeup or acting, it's the real fatigue of a man who has been to the edge and looked over, day after day, take after take. That authenticity is what makes the scene, and the entire performance, so powerful and so disturbing. In the end, the story of Jack Nicholson and The Shining is a story about the price of excellence, the cost of truth, and the sacrifices demanded by art that aspires to greatness. Nicholson went to work on a movie in 1978, and in a very real sense, he never came back the same. Part of him remained in the Overlook Hotel, in that frozen maze, trapped in the amber of that iconic final shot where Jack's face stares out from a photograph dated July 4, 1921. That face, frozen in time, grinning with a madness that feels utterly real because in the moment it was captured, it was real, represents both Nicholson's greatest artistic achievement and his most profound sacrifice. We watch The Shining and we're entertained, terrified, and amazed. But we should also remember that what we're watching cost someone something real, something precious, something that can never be fully recovered. That's the unspoken contract between audiences and actors. They give us pieces of themselves, pieces they can never get back, and all we can do is honor that sacrifice by recognizing it, understanding it, and carrying it forward in our memory of their work. Jack Nicholson survives, of course. He's still with us, living his life away from the cameras now, no longer feeling the need to prove anything or to venture into those dark psychological territories. But somewhere in his mind, Jack Torrance still lives, still types that eternal sentence, still stalks through the corridors of the Overlook Hotel with an axe in hand and madness in his eyes. And on those quiet nights when sleep is elusive and memories surface unbidden, perhaps Nicholson remembers what it felt like to be that man, to inhabit that consciousness, to cross that line between self and other. Perhaps he remembers and wonders, as we all might, whether some lines once crossed can never truly be uncrossed, or whether we carry forever the places we've been and the people we've pretended to be. That's the real horror at the heart of The Shining, not the ghosts or the isolation or the violence, but the suggestion that we contain within us the capacity for our own undoing, and that if we look too closely at that darkness within, we might find it looking back. Jack Nicholson looked, and what he saw was brilliant, terrifying, and utterly unforgettable. And he never came back quite the same.